Hi everybody, I'm Angelia. Welcome back to Read and Reread. It's time for Friday Reads. It's the last Friday Reads of February, believe it or not. It kind of snuck up on me the way February's conclusion will do, and I realized I was working this morning on my March TBR, so that'll be my next video, I think. But anyway, it is time for Friday Reads. One of the books I want to talk about today, I actually read last week, but I completely forgot to talk about it in last week's video. I had already turned the book into the library, and it was just classic out of sight, out of mind. And then afterwards, I was writing in my reading journal and I saw it and I'm like, okay, well, so I think I mentioned a note about it in the editing, but I didn't actually talk about it. So I will amend this omission. So, before we talk about the books, a quick word on this week in viewing. We are continuing with watching Shrinking, which is funny, and The Last of Us, which is harrowing, with a very, very occasional moment of funniness. But it's really good if you like science fiction kind of thing. Um, I have no knowledge of the video game. I know people who are really into the game have all these kind of like, the book versus movie sort of qualms or whatever. I don't care because I don't know anything about the game. But I'm enjoying the show. And then, because those are releasing bit by bit, we needed another show to watch. And so, in our endless quest to find the most dark and depressing stories available to view, we watched Mare of Easttown, which was a pretty good mystery show, well acted. Man, that was some dark stuff. I mean, the whole town is just, every single family is screwed up. Every single person has trauma and secrets, and I mean, they didn't even finish explaining some of it. So it was good, but boy, man, it was some heavy material. Anyway, let's move on to the books. The book that I forgot to talk about from last week was a suspenseful book. In fact, all three of these books are suspenseful in different ways. This first one was These Silent Woods by Kimi Cunningham Grant. I read this book based on a rave review by Kim over at Middle of the Book March, and I feel like she and I like similar mystery and suspense novels based on things she's talked about on her channel. So thank you, Kim. This was a good one. I checked it out from the library. Okay, so here's the premise. There is a man named Cooper and his 8-year-old daughter Fitch. That's who we meet at the beginning of the story. And they are living out in a cabin in the woods, totally off the grid. They have no electricity. I guess they use a well for their water. They're just living rough. And they've been living like this, we find, since she was a baby. The reasons that they are living there, why they came to be there, are gradually revealed. Cooper is telling the story, and he gradually does tell us the backstory of what happened to lead to this situation. So the only people they ever see are two people. His friend Jake, who comes once a year and brings supplies things that they can't do for themselves. So they do hunting and some gardening, but he brings a big, massive amount of supplies once a year in December. And he has a running list of what he's going to bring because Cooper doesn't have a phone or anything else like that for communication. And we do find that the cabin that they live in belonged to Jake's family. His father built it, and his father was a literature professor, so it is full of classic books, which explains why little Finch goes around quoting Theodore Recca and Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson all the time as an 8-year-old. It's pretty funny. But there's one part where she starts quoting, I knew a woman lovely in her bones. And I thought, I guess the racy part went over her head. She's just into the descriptive part. But anyway, I digress. So they live in this cabin, and Jake comes once a year and brings supplies. And the only other person who knows that they are there apparently is this older dude named Scotland, who lives somewhere nearby and apparently has a high-powered telescope or some kind of scoping device, because he always knows what's going on at their cabin. He knows the comings and goings, and he just sort of mysteriously appears with various pieces of somewhat sinister advice. So we're not really sure if Scotland is helpful or foreboding for a long portion of this book. And Cooper's not crazy about him, but Finch loves him. She loves him. She loves Jake. She is the personality type who's looking for connection and looking for more people to talk to, whereas Cooper's is kind of okay with not ever seeing or talking to anybody. And he was kind of that personality type before any of the events happened that led to this situation. But we learn about that gradually, as I have mentioned. So a year comes around when the story opens and Finch is 8 years old and Jake does not appear at the expected time. And because he doesn't show up and Cooper has no way to know why or what has occurred to Jake, he does have to go into a nearby town for supplies. And that leads to somehow the most suspenseful scene of someone shopping at a Walmart that you've ever read in your life. Even though you don't know why it's a hazardous thing for him to be at the Walmart, somehow this spirit of hoping that he gets in and out of this store without anything weird happening is highly suspenseful. So anyway, that's kind of all the things that happen right at the beginning. But the fact that Jake doesn't show up is sort of like the first catalyst in a time of change, where Cooper's going to have to reevaluate what's going on, and a number of things occur, and he has to make some decisions. And so there's a mystery of sorts because we don't know what has happened, and we learn about it piece by piece. And there's a feeling of suspense because you find that you're rooting for them, but at the same time you're still questioning, well, what exactly happened that you feel like you need to live this way? So it's just always about parenting too, and the father and daughter bond, and try to think ahead into your child's future, which we all do, even if we're not out hiding in a cabin in the woods. And so it's a very touching story. My only negative remark about this story, it's not really a negative remark, it's more like a personal reading preference. There is an epilogue at the very end of the story, and in my opinion, the epilogue was unnecessary. I kind of like it when a book ends a little bit askew. Like, I don't want something to be just cut off abruptly in the middle of the plot, but when things end with a lot left open to your imagination, it's like some things are resolved and some things you think, well, how's that exactly going to work? I'm really good with that. I like the element of not having everything wrapped up or having something to consider. And there's a place in this novel where it does stop at a point like that. And I found it very satisfying. And there were enough surprises and things along the way and, revelations that I was very happy when we got to that ending. And I think that some readers will love that there's that epilogue there. And I'd like to see what is, I won't say what it is, but, what you find out in that part. But to me, that detracted it, like it was a weak point, because it raised a bunch of extra questions that I wasn't questioning before I read it. And then my last takeaway was, well, wait a minute, how did, like just mentioning a bunch of things made me want to know more about those things. So I would have been happier if I had just stopped before the epilogue. So that was, anyway, that was These Silent Woods, which I really enjoyed. I do recommend this book. Then this is what I was reading when I left off. I had just started The Marriage Portrait by Maggie O'Farrell. I found this to be a really good, solid historical fiction book. I'm going to tell you what it was about and what I liked, but I'm just going to say that I feel like, and maybe some other people feel like this too, I kind of haunted myself a little bit with Hamnet when I was reading this, because I loved Hamnet so much, and I felt this really strong connection to Agnes in that story. And this is a totally different book. And so I guess I didn't love it as much as that, but if I had never read Hamnet and I didn't know anything about that, and this was the first book I read by Maggie O'Farrell, I would have thought, wow, this is great. So I feel like I I kind of created that problem for myself, and it's not really a problem, if that makes any sense. But so anyway, in this book, Lucretia de Medici is married off to the Duke of Ferrara, whose name is Alfonso, at the age of 15. In real life, she was married to him at the age of 13, but then she lived at home for a couple more years while he was off at a war. But they kind of consolidated things in this story, and even though he wanted to marry her at 13, it ended up happening at 15. And to find out about the gap and how O'Farrell accounts for it, you will have to read the novel. So she is a daughter in a family of many, many children. You know, the boys are destined for certain roles. The girls are destined to marry, and that creates alliances between different families. And so Lucretia's sister is supposed to marry Alfonso, but Maria dies unexpectedly, and the other sister, Isabella, is already engaged to somebody else, and they want to preserve that upcoming marriage, and so they give Lucretia to Alfonso. She is not happy about this. She is a strong-willed, gifted, and talented young girl who really just wants to be left alone to paint and draw and think and read. But we have two time periods in this book, and at the one time period is almost a year after the marriage, and she has been taken away to this kind of isolated hunting lodge by her husband, and leaving behind all of the servants that they usually have, including her personal maid, and there's a few other people that work at this lodge, but nobody who knows her or recognizes her. And she realizes she's isolated with him, and it occurs to her that he has brought her out here for the purpose of murdering her. And why she thinks that is revealed bit by bit as we hear the story between the time that she marries and up to this point. So it becomes rather suspenseful. When I first started reading it, I saw this page that includes the first line of the poem My Last Duchess by Robert Browning. That's my last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. I pulled out my copy of My Last Duchess. I happen to have it in this book. Here's a digression. This book is the textbook from a class that I took in college called Literature in Performance. And the whole class was about basically reading aloud to groups. We had to perform poems, pieces from novels and plays and different kinds of things. And I have found that to be one of the most useful classes I ever took. And so there was advice in this class not only on the performance of the literature, but also like how to prepare when you're going to speak to a group, different tricks of the trade for not being nervous when you have to make a presentation. And I just use a lot of things from that class all through my career. So anyway, that was just a little aside. So I kept the book because it's a pretty good anthology of short pieces that I like to go back to. And so that's where I have a copy of My Last Duchess, but you can find it online too if you want to read the poem. So I got it out and read it before I started reading the book. And then as I was reading the book, as I got far enough along that Alfonso was in the story as a character, I had to stop and go back and read the poem again because I was amazed at how Maggie O'Farrell took this famous poem, which is well known to have sort of the Duke of Ferrara narrates the poem, and he's talking about a painting of his last Duchess that he keeps behind a curtain, and he's showing it to a visitor, and he's talking about her and how the painting was made. And in his description of her in the painting, an air of menace and danger begins to permeate the poem, and you start to wonder what actually happened to that Duchess. And then at the end of the poem, he kind of abruptly snaps back into his cordial personality, and he's like, okay, well, let's go down and talk to the Count, and they're getting ready to kind of broker a deal for the next woman that he wants to marry. And she captured that entire thing in the character of Alfonso in this book. The his sense of being um, a dangerous person, a dangerous person, a capricious person, someone who can snap between moods really quickly, somebody who's hard to read, hard to predict. Um, just the air of menacing capacity that he has is that's his character in the novel, and it's all right there in the poem as well. So I love how that made the leap into the novel, especially because she didn't have a lot of information to go on as far as what these people were like. The facts just stand that she did marry this man. She did die within a year, and it was always rumored that she might have been murdered. I recommend that you read a little bit of biographical information about her family and his family and the history of the demise of the women. Maybe wait till after you read the novel, just because there might be some of it is, people are in the story, but it's pretty interesting. All right, but anyway, back to the story. So I really love that sense of suspense, and people have talked about the ending. I've heard people say that they love this ending. I heard people say they weren't happy with this ending. I loved this ending. I thought this ending, I can't tell you a single thing about it, but I love how she concluded this novel. My only caveat about this book, the thing that I noticed was that I felt an intrusion of modern day sensibilities a couple of times in the descriptions. And this is supposed to be a 15-year-old girl who's thrust into this new situation. She's been very sheltered, even though she's got a very, very busy mind and a strong will. She has been very structured and limited in what she's exposed to. And then all of a sudden, she's in a new setting and she's trying to figure out on the fly how to behave. What's the Duchess supposed to act like? How's she supposed to hold her face while we're riding through this crowd? What's the right response to my husband? Why did that make him mad? How can I not make him mad? And she's thinking about like trying to preserve her personal self somewhere deep within that he can't have access to. All of that I think is realistic for a 15-year-old to think about, but then it goes beyond, and there's some parts where she has these thoughts that are very critical about their social group, the role of women, the way that the servants are treated. There's a part where she's thinking about the castratos that come to perform, and the complexity of her critical thoughts are unlikely to be occurring in a 15-year-old girl of that place and time who hasn't had time to process any of that. It seems like the thoughts of a more mature person who has been ruminating on this for some time. I don't know, I felt like the author coming in and making commentaries when that happened. All right, but overall, I really did enjoy reading it, and I do recommend it. If I had to go on a desert island and only take Hamnet or The Marriage Portrait, I'm taking Hamnet, but I still really did love my experience of reading this. All right, now, sadly, we now come to a book that I cannot give such a rave review to, and that was Upgrade by Blake Crouch. Now, this is a completely random read. Do not go back and try to pin this down in my February TBR because it isn't there. I just picked this up willy-nilly at the library because I have read these books up here in the corner, Recursion and Dark Matter, and I found them to be fun, fast-paced. You know, I like to read a book in between the more serious books that's either a murder mystery or something else that's going to be kind of, thrills and chills. So previous books I've read of his tapped into some theories of physics and I don't even know what, chemistry? I don't know. But there's always something scientific that I don't know that much about, and I just kind of accept what he tells me, and I just run with it and enjoy the ride. But in this one, it did not work out like that. So the premise is great. And here's the idea. There's this guy named Logan who his job is, it's a little bit in the future and it's a little dystopian. He works for a government agency that hunts down scientists or other people that are doing illegal genetic modification work. Genetic modification of any kind has become illegal after an event. I think it took place 15, 20 years earlier, maybe more, and in which a brilliant scientist was attempting to modify an insect, and it was going to improve the rice industry, and it was this insect was supposed to make everything better for the food chain, blah blah blah. But there was a flaw, and she ended up setting off this worldwide famine. And unfortunately, that brilliant scientist was Logan's mother. She shortly thereafter drove her car off a cliff and committed suicide. So there was Logan and his sister. Previous to this, he had a twin brother who had passed away of cancer, and then his dad, and the grief of it all, had also committed suicide. So Logan, at the time of the big famine set off, he was a college student, and he was doing some lab assistant work with his mother, and he ended up becoming a scapegoat because she dies in the aftermath. He gets scapegoated and spends a few years in prison for being part of the experimentation to begin with. And after he gets out, he ends up getting a job with this agency. So they go and bust labs because they're scientists who are defying the odds because they think their project is more important than the law. They monitor scientists in a big database to try to profile who they think might participate in these kind of crimes. So early in the book, he goes on a raid, and something gets set off that explodes, and it gives him this virus that carries a gene editing whatever it is. And at first they monitor him and they say, you know what, I think it didn't do anything, you're fine, nothing's happening. And so he goes about his business. But a few weeks later, he starts to feel these changes. All of a sudden, like, he gets all these really bad body aches. He goes to the doctor, finds out that his bones are becoming denser. And then he realizes that his mind is working faster, and he has more stamina, and he doesn't need as much sleep, and all these kind of crazy things. And so he realizes that something really did happen. That's where I'm going to cut off my plot description so I don't spoil it in case you decide to read this. But, all right, so what happened to me at this point is I was reading this whole long half page of genetic explainery, and this and that and the other, and how this would happen in a human body. And I started wondering how real it was, how accurate it was. So I decided to consult a young biologist whose studies my husband and I had been funding, which of course is our daughter Emma, who's a biology major. So I screenshotted a page and sent it to her. And Blake Crouch did not fare well in her reply. She pointed out several weirdnesses in the description where she was, I don't understand the original thing or her reply, but she was kind of like, well, why are they using white blood cells for that? And that's supposed to be nucleotides and da-da-da-da. And then her summary of the whole thing was, this isn't really that hard to explain. I think this author's just lazy. Like, whoa, okay, ouch. It wasn't really oversimplified for me. It was just kind of boring every time he got into those sides of the genetics and the codes and the DNA. I was just kind of like, okay, whatever, back to the plot. So that happened a lot in this book, though. They just stopped short, and there'd be this long jag of, code breaking and DNA explanations. And now every time I saw it, I was like, lazy science. I just didn't believe any of it. But the plot moves along, and it keeps a lot of exciting things happen, but the overall theme ends up being so simplistic that I felt kind of hoodwinked by reading this entire story. I kept expecting things to get a little more intricate, and then they did not. So it's fast-paced. there's a bunch of boring jags in between. And the thing that's the most annoying is that, besides all of the crouch splaining that happens, is that Logan, as he changes, he keeps stopping and lamenting his former life and, missing his family. And then he'll think, but I am not that man anymore. That Logan is no more. So I must go forward. And he does this about 12 times. He just stops short, has this like sad moment, and then realizes that he's different. And it's like, again, can you wrap your mind around it? I thought you had a fast paced mind. So let's just sum it up by saying I wasn't impressed by Upgrade by Blake Crouch. And I'm throwing it on the floor, and we're going to leave it at that. What did you read this week? Did you read anything really great? Let me know what's going on. I'm still waiting for some books that some of you recommended that are being processed ever so slowly at the library. And, but yeah, shout it out if you read something great. And if you read any of these books that I talked about this week, that's it for now. I hope you have an excellent reading weekend. If you're in one of those cold and snowy places, I hope you stay cozy inside. I am in one of the hot and sweaty places. It looks like we're divided half and half this weekend across the United States, and I'm in the sweaty half. So have a great weekend. I think I'm going to go to the beach. I'll see you later. Bye.